Fine. I can start with your questions from your email if you like.
Sure, thank you.
Um, because I think that maybe I hope it's useful.
Hmm.
But do you have those questions with you, or should I just pick them up?
I do. I have them. Yes. So the first one I had asked, um, you know, how does one apply to be considered for and recognized as an open air museum? Um,
Yeah, and then I have to start with who has which authority. And if you look at museums worldwide, then you could say ICOM has authority, but they don't have that kind of legal authority even about the museum definition.
hmm,
So if you start with the international the ICOM museum definition, everybody can have its own definition, and it's up to each country on its own to make a reference to, for example, the ICOM museum definition in their law.
hmm,
So there are no international bodies who can say in the US a museum is this and this. ICOM can in general say um, we believe as a group of museologists that this is what defines a museum, and in some countries that is indeed added to the law somewhere. Like we consider in Scotland that a museum is if it fits the definition of ICOM, for example.
hmm,
Just an example. I don't know if in Scotland they would say so, but
right.
it's up to every single country um, to decide what the status is of such a definition.
Okay.
And giving that as example of ICOM is worldwide the most well known organization of museums. If you look at the definition of an open air museum, then indeed worldwide, especially in Europe, well, EXAC is mainly based in Europe, but not only Europe. The AEOM, Association of European Open Air Museums, of course, is European. But even so, they have links with America,
Hmm,
with the United States and North America in general. The AEOM is from about 1974, if I know well, and their definition of an open air museum dates also back to the 70s. And I don't think they have revised it since.
hmm,
But it's also like, okay, if we are in this club of AOM colleagues, when we talk about open air museums, what do we mean? So it has no legal binding status, so to say. And then we come to, I'm first telling the depressing story. And then we come to EXAC, where I think about 10 years ago, it's on the website, when exactly we thought, okay, we talk about historical workshops, education centers. We had a lot of different names when we started for those places. And then we had this meeting I think in Sweden it was, where we said, okay, we have to come with one phrase: archaeological open air museums, contrary to historical open air museums. So you could consider the AEOM Skansen type museums, the ethnographic museums, you
hmm.
could consider them historical open air museums, and let's say our museums are archaeological open air museums. And then we tried to define that. I was in that process, and some things didn't make it to the definition which I would have liked to be, like, for example, a limitation in space and time. Like, for example, what I would say, you don't build a copy or reconstruction of a Greek temple in Sweden
Hmm.
because it doesn't fit space and time. But that didn't make it to the definition. But that's another story. I mean, we will talk about it probably later today. But yeah, it was for ease of talking for us in EXAC, for colleagues. What do we mean with a? And now we talk about AOAM because it's such a long name,
Hmm.
Archaeological Open Air Museum. What do we mean by that? So it's mainly to make it easier to speak with each other, to communicate, than that it has a legal status. However, we do realize that since the moment we started to talk about archaeological open-air museums, this phrase has become more and more in use in the international English-speaking world, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I mean, I was directing a museum in Germany, which was called Archäologisches Freilichtmuseum Erlinghausen. Erlinghausen is the name of the village, and Archäologisches Freilichtmuseum literally means archaeological open-air museum. So it's being used much more than 20, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more for ease of talking, so to say. Yeah, maybe that's enough for this moment. I don't know what's the next question.
The next one was you might have even answered. I have to just read it quickly. Oh, so I was asking, why do you think that these definitions have not been adopted by the United States? That it seems to tie into UNESCO or ICOM or AEOM.
Yeah,
But
well, EXARC is an affiliated organization to ICOM. The AEOM is also an affiliated organization to ICOM. ICOM is still very much European centered.
mm-hmm.
That's one of the problems.
Mm-hmm.
AUM, of course, is only European.
Mm-hmm.
EXARC is mainly European, but we do our best to go beyond Europe, and then we find the United States somewhere on that planet.
Mm-hmm.
And in the United States, as you also already said, the main organization is ALFAM,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't call these places archaeological open-air museums. They call these places living history museums, and that's a bit complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Also, very important in the United States is the National Park Service.
Yes. Yes.
Because they have, I mean, we made a map, actually, I tried to make a map of what we could find worldwide of archaeological open-air museums. It's on our website. And we have about 200, 300, maybe 200 in the United States. On a map, for everyone we have a little text and a little dot on the map, so to say. Many of those are National Park Service, NPS sites.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then again, we didn't, for example, Alfam, we didn't plot all of the Alfam museums because they don't fit 100% our definition. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
an agricultural museum but have no reconstructed buildings based on archaeology, we
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't accept that. So the problem bit in the United States is that it's not a problem that you have the Alfam. It's very good to have them, but they have a very different approach. And I think their reason for clustering this type of museums, agricultural and living history museums, is probably a different one than what we would have in Europe. I mean, in Europe, it's very much and they based on archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
When the Alfam museums, the living history museums, many of them are based on historical remains. Or let's say there's a fortress somewhere where a fort where one or two buildings have still been remaining, and they excavated the rest or part of the rest, reconstructed that. So it's Colonial Williamsburg is a great example where when I visited the first time, they asked me, "How would you define this place?"
Mm-hmm.
It's not an archaeological open air museum per se. I said no. Colonial Williamsburg is like four or so different aspects in one. It's a historical site, and that's also a thing. Site museums. There's an article or two about that in the Exarch Journal. Site museums are a separate category. Some of them have a reconstructed building. Some of them are just the site where let's say a park where you can walk through. So the problem is indeed, what do you define and why do you define it? I think it's very, very important. Why does Alfam call their places living history museums?
Mm-hmm.
You could ask them,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
but they don't. They don't use the phrase archaeological open air museums at all. Yeah, I think what we have here is archaeological open air museums in Europe. Most of them are based 90% on archaeology, and then it's medieval or earlier. There are not very many after that, but that technically the what is if it's based on something of 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago doesn't really matter for the definition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think in America there's a lot of talk about living history museums, and I don't really know, but that's maybe something good to discuss, and I can maybe get you in touch with a few people at Alpha.
Okay.
What is the link between Elfam and MPS? Why are certain things defined in a certain way? What's the use?
Right, right. Um, yeah, I find that it was kind of confusing to try to put uh, our historic mill into this living history because it's not. But that was the closest thing that I can get to.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what I find a problem with the phrase living history museums is that it's based on what is happening there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, living history is one way of interpretation.
Right.
Here in Europe, we also have something where we call archeotechnique, where the people are not in costume, but then maybe in modern dress, explaining a certain like bow and arrow, for example, bow and arrow shooting. They
Mm-hmm.
will say, well, they're not dressed up like whatever 18th century or 16th century people, but they're dressed in modern uniform, let's say, and they're
Mm-hmm.
showing the public, well, this is how you do it. So living history museums for me is too much based on one activity. When I think in a reconstructed environment, you can do much more. Is it guided to a living history? They will say no, but I say it's a very valid activity in a
Mm-hmm.
reconstructed environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Yeah.
Have you? I don't want to make too much advertising. Have you seen my dissertation?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, there's certain small, I mean, it's old, it's 10 years old, but certain small parts, like what kind of activities can you expect in an open air museum, are maybe still useful for you.
Okay. Yeah. I think
And I will later point you to, let's see, where am I? This book, it's Steen Rensok, Open Air Museums. I will send you, you know
okay.
what? I'm going to stand up and pick it up.
Hmm.
Where am I? Here. This is a bit too prehistoric. Okay. Like the Romans. It's this book,
Okay.
and I will send you later the link
Okay.
called Steen. It's by a Swedish guy, Steen Rensok, so European, and he wrote it at the end of his. Well, he's not he when he retired. It's
Mm-hmm.
Open Air Museums: The History and Future of a Visionary Idea.
Mm-hmm.
He very much focuses on living history as a technique. But in general, it's very good. If you want to know some background about also US, it's not just European. He also takes North America in his book.
Okay.
It's interesting.
Okay. Thank you for that. Um, so, so going back to what you had said about a historic site, so do rehabilitated buildings that are in situ, or is that considered to be a true open air museum if it's not reconstructed? Like in my circumstance, none of the buildings have been reconstructed; they are the actual preserved buildings, architectural buildings. So by definition, does that can that be considered an open air museum?
Well, I think what I also tried to say in my dissertation, um, it's what you do there, the activities,
Mm-hmm.
which for in my perspective and not in a legal perspective, would define what you have. I mean, if I look at the descriptions you sent, it's an original site, so I would consider it as, and then it's a site, and
Mm-hmm.
if it's a museum, that depends a bit on what you do there. I would
Okay.
consider it a site museum if there's some kind of interpretation, but you can best look at the new ICOM definition of museums, which is only 2 months old.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's especially, I mean, you can consider the buildings or the place like how do you call it? In a theater, the I forgot the English word. Let me have a look because it is. I'm sorry, I'm a bit. Uh, Here we go. Let's find the word. Where do we? Ah, difficult.
Mm.
I have it. It doesn't want to find it.
Mm.
Uh, when you build it, when you have a theater
Mm-hmm.
and you have the, let's say, the walls which are all fake, um,
Right.
um,
Like a scene or
the
back.
backdrop, so to say, the scene,
Mm-hmm.
the buildings. I mean, they are very very important, but they are the scenes of where you do something, and I think what you do is very important if you for the definition of the place. I mean, I spoke a while ago with somebody from Israel who was discussing, yeah, it would be great if their sites, archaeological sites, could be defined as museum, because if they're defined as museum by Israeli law, they can get funding.
Right.
And I think this is what's happening with you in your place is something similar. It very much depends on how the law is constructed. But I
Okay.
would say the activities, what you do there, are most important. You were somewhere mentioning like um, they don't like to have guided tours. It's a closed area, and one thing which didn't make it to our definition of archaeological open air museums was you have to be open at least so many days per year.
Mm-hmm.
But even though that's not in the definition, also not in the definition of a museum, um, I think it's important that it's something to keep in mind. That I mean, either you have two, 3 times per year a weekend which is a festival, and then you have things happening there. That doesn't make it a museum.
Mm.
I would say there are two types of activities, but I would say on the one hand you have activities for, let's say, loose visitors, call them tourists if you like, and on the other hand you have educational visits for booked groups, say school groups, for example,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and usually in museum context they say, well, school groups fine, but if you only have school groups visiting, even if it's every week, we don't call it a museum, we call it an educational center.
Mm.
But
Okay.
it's still very valid and also very useful to get funding from local government. So because you have a certain, you carry out a certain educational, well, duty or however you want to call it. So in that sense, it adds a lot to the value of your site if you have such activities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tourist visits, well, I sometimes say you can start with starting one time per year, a little festival of 2, 3 days. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have to be big, and then you slowly expand it. You can also have workshops, for example, where people have to register to attend the workshop, and if you have 6 people or 10 people, the workshop can take place.
Mm-hmm.
And you can build it up slowly, and that way also you create some revenue. So you don't. It's quite risk free because you can only do the workshop if you have enough participants.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that it's not necessarily the building, it's but what you do in that space. Okay. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
else it's just a site. It's an interesting site or a historic house,
Right.
but it's just a place. I think it's indeed what if it's locked, if it's closed, and nobody visits it,
Mhm.
uh, then it's not a museum.
Right. Right. And then it's a failed public history site, which currently it is. I mean, we have been giving tours off and on for the past 6 years. It was a little bit more frequent, but every time the board changes at the residential community, then it's a re-education, and then we're right back at the very beginning, and then
Yeah.
everything
Hmm.
halts. But I do know that if things do not happen on this property, then it risks losing valuable pieces of architecture because it needs to be kept. It needs to be sheared and it needs to be protected because it's going to fall apart at some point.
Yeah, it's biting its own tail. I mean,
Right,
if it's slowly deconstructs, so to say, if it slowly falls apart, then it will lose its status, and then that's the end of it.
right,
But on the other hand, the people living there must feel what's in it for them.
right, right.
And I mean, if they say, well, we feel there's enough identity even if nobody visits, I mean, that's the usual thing, not in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they say, well, it has enough identity for us itself anyway. Yeah, but for the next generation of people living there, it doesn't have that identity anymore.
Right, right. Yeah, it's
So
been an
you have to keep it
interesting,
alive, yeah.
yeah, it's been an interesting uphill battle. Um, and and is what my nonprofit museum does is continually preserve these stories and preserve the history and keep it going for the generations to come. Um,
Yeah, you know what, if I may say something, what if you look at if you later look at the definition, the new definition of museums, it shows not where museums are right now, but where they would like museums to go,
mm,
being relevant for local society, being a clubhouse, so to say, keeping the people together, telling the story of the place, the story of the site.
mm-hmm,
Um, I think you have very good chances with the new definition
mm-hmm,
of museums, saying, look, it's a community place. It's the museum is not a temple where you keep something only for the happy few, but it's something to bring the whole society together. It's relevant. It's about sustainability also. I mean, not sustainability in the sense of environmental sustainability, but sustainability of the social sustainability of the society. And I think if people see that, if that hits them, then I think they will understand, okay, it is very useful. And this makes the place unique. And
mm-hmm,
if it's not unique, it will be gone and it loses value.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
You need to find indeed what is it, and you have it. What are the unique selling points, so to say, if you want to put it in a commercial way? What's the unique bits? Why must it be there? And what's the relevance for the people living there, but also the people who would be visiting?
mm-hmm. Right, right. Now, say that the residents get on board, and there's more activities on this residential complex, and it's now an open air museum. What's the next step? Like, who would I have to talk to get that recognized? Um, that's what I'm trying also to figure out. So sure, we can come up with the definition and do all these activities, but how do you get recognized? How does that get? It's not like I can go to the American Alliance of Museums because they don't recognize it as an open air museum. They don't recognize open air museums. So that's the interesting question.
Yeah, and there I don't know enough about the situation in the United
Right.
States,
Right.
and I think it's good in this that it will get you in touch with some people, some experienced people at Alfam,
Yes.
maybe the National Park Service. The exact chair, our chair is Peter Inker, and he's from Colonial Williamsburg. So you could also contact him
Okay.
directly. Chair, it's simple. You will find his email address on the website, chair@exact.net, and you can tell him you spoke with me, and but give him very specific questions. Don't give him the whole story, to be
Sure.
honest.
Sure.
For me, it's fine, but I think for him, it's a bit. He's maybe more busy than I am. But indeed, very targeted question like, if this is the situation you want to solve, um, could he have a chat with you, or would he know somebody you could speak with?
Okay. Thank you for that.
And indeed, if you would be if you would be willing to indeed define that also to me in just 3 4 sentences in an email, then
Okay.
I can contact 2 3 people in the US in the Alfam circles who will be more than willing to talk with you. Some of them are retired, so they have a bit more time, but
Sure.
have enormous experience, especially because the Alpha museums are also not always considered museum.
Mm.
They're considered often visitor center.
Mm-hmm.
A visitor center is nice, but the phrase visitor center refers only to, oh, I can get a cup of coffee there. It's also visitor center. It's
Right.
more than that, of course.
Right. Right. I think this is a very unique situation, having this, this history in a gated residential community. I don't really, I haven't come across anything similar to this in my research. So it would be really fascinating to see if this could be a model for other historic residential communities, that have the potential of becoming museums.
You know what? If you write a bit longer message, I'm just thinking I can put it on the LFAM email list
Mm,
where I don't know 100 people or so are tagging along, and we can see who responds there.
okay.
Because I think you're right that this is quite unique situation, but each of, I mean, all the components together are unique in this setting, I
Mm-hmm.
think, but each of them exist elsewhere or maybe in a combination of factors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think some of this, for example, is it's not as a gated community, but Colonial Williamsburg also has people living in the middle of their museum.
Okay. Right. Okay. Sorry. My husband has a question because he's been listening
Yes,
to
of
this.
course, of course.
Come here. Come here.
Well, I'm not going to get on screen.
Okay. Right.
But this is going back towards the relevance. Like, how is this site relevant to not just the residents, but beyond, like to the history of Georgia, to the history of the city of Atlanta, and even to the United States. We just recently were awarded a historical marker. It's a very competitive marker, and it's only given out by the state of Georgia when the state of Georgia recognizes a site as having all of the merits and the various attributes of an important site. So I mean, so I guess this is more of a site museum, is what you're saying, than an open air museum. Would that be accurate? Because the buildings have been converted, they have been rehabilitated, no longer. I mean, clearly they're never going to be used again for their original purpose as a cotton mill, but the facades are always going to be maintained as they were in their original state. And that's very important for Atlanta preservation, for our city and for our state, is that the facades, the interiors can be modified any way they want to be, as far as rehabilitation. But to maintain our historic status, we can never alter the exteriors. So would that, if we were to put up interpretive signage and continue tours and create more of an educational environment, would that give us open air status? Would it be site museum status? Uh-oh, y'all are reaching the end of your 40-minute period. You might have to.
No, we have 10 minutes and else we start again.
Yeah. I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there hasn't been any, I guess I should say there hasn't been the attempt to recreate anything. And like you were saying earlier on, it's often in an open air museum, there will be like a new dwelling built to emulate what was previously there, like maybe in Williamsburg, Virginia. There may be new structures, but they look like they're from the 1700s. Here, we'll never have that. We're always going to.
That's not a problem at all. I think interpretation of the stories, and the stories are the most important thing, and you tell them on exactly the right place. It's there where it happened. The stories are linked to the site. Yes. How you present those stories, if you have a AR, VR, or whatsoever, or if you have people dressed up, or you have guided tours, or you have what I call this archaeotechnic way of doing things, that doesn't matter. Those are ways of presenting the story, of sharing the stories. The fact that these buildings are not the way they used to be back then doesn't matter. There's enough left to give people the feeling I'm on the exact right place. To this exact right place, the site is half of the definition. A museum is then the other half. Let's say that depends on the activities you present there, what you do there. And I think the value of the site increases enormously if you do the right activities with the right background. And so I would say no fantasy, LARP, or whatsoever, very loosely inspired by the past. But of course you can be creative, and of course you can have artists, for example, who do things inspired by the original stories. So the original stories are, together with being on that spot, are your treasure.
Yes. Yes, we're not very interested in doing like you said, LARP or any kind of reenactments with actors pretending that they're mill workers. I know that's been bounced around a lot here. In fact, we think one person's about to approach us about this topic again. We are interested in AR, which you mentioned.
Yeah,
so
I think so. That would work. I guess from what I've seen, it would work at a place like yours very well. And indeed, as I said before, it doesn't matter that 2/3 or so of the site and the interior is gone. With AR, you can still tell the stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
You will have the magic of being on the original place.
Yeah.
Yes, and that there's no doubt that does exist here. People, when they come on this property, they know they're in a different time, a different place, a lost period of Atlanta history, but that has been preserved. And we can tell the story because a great deal of it still exists, and in a very well-preserved way. They've gone to great measures to maintain the 19th century look of a lot of these buildings, which obviously pales in comparison to the rest of the world's history, because we don't have a lot of history here in Atlanta. But this is part of it. This is one of the few places that actually has Atlanta history. It's not even 200 years old.
It doesn't matter how old it is. It's magic. It fits there perfectly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool. Wow. Well, I think that they answered all of my questions. That's pretty awesome.
I think it's also the title of my book. The value of the place is in how you use it.
Yeah.
And that will increase the value also for the authorities. Definition 1 or definition 2 doesn't really matter. You can be creative about how you define. I mean, it's unique in one way or the other, and you can define yourself what fits in and what doesn't fit in, and say this is our mission, vision, and etc. This is what we are, and based on that, you can see if there's funding available from foundations or I guess there should be options like that, or whatsoever. So it doesn't matter really. Do you fit in this box? Do you fit in that box? Or do you fit in the third box? You don't fit in perfectly, and that's exactly how it should be. Your place is in that sense unique, and you have a bit of this character, a bit of that. It's a matter of describing that well. Say this is what we do, this is what we don't do, and that's why and from that derives the value of your site.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that having the definition of open air museum can be adopted and adapted to my situation or whomever's situation. It doesn't have to be so cookie cutter. Yeah. Okay.
That's great. It actually makes us feel, or me, I'll speak for myself, I feel better about our situation.
Right.
Because we've been a little bit down on how the residents have, in a lot of ways, handcuffed us over the last couple of years during the pandemic. We lost, like Nina said, a lot of ground in opening, not physically opening, not taking down the gates and the barriers to the rest of the world, but the ability to allow the public to access our community at all has been hampered by our current board our current board is actually good. It was the previous board and the pandemic, of course. But I think that with these types of topics we're discussing right now and the way that you presented it, this is an excellent way to move forward and have a better recognized approach to allowing public access. And therefore, at least creating the understanding that we do live in a museum, whether it's site or open, it's unique. We just need to have a great way to present it in an educational way that shows how it's unique, shows the place and time. And I think that we're on that path. We just need to keep.
Yeah, and a museum is not something old-fashioned. It's not a temple from whatever. It's a It can be indeed a community place, relevant to society, linking the past with the present. And I think you're rooted in the past, but it's still very much in the present.
Oh,
I think if people understand, like, okay, this makes us stronger, that would probably help. If I may say, about when you write a message, which I can forward to the LFAM group, indeed mention what I said before. Mention what you're looking for, or maybe through them. Maybe I would say try to get some. I would want to find some people who were willing to discuss some typical US part of this story, where if there's some other people who can have a little dialogue with you in these specific US things.
Yeah,
that would be awesome. Yeah. This has been great. It has solidified some things for my thesis. I'm right on target, so I'm happy about that. Yeah, I guess I have a little bit more writing to do before I defend on November 10th. But this is great.
What is on November 10th?
My defense.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, in that case, if you only have 1 month left, make your questions for LFAM as specific as possible, and I'm happy to send it on anytime you email me.
Thank you.
But this can become a long and big thing. But as my professor would say, at this moment it's just a thesis, and get the thesis indeed, let's say, in your hands, and it's like a proof of concept. A thesis is just like, this is probably the way forward. You don't have to prove it. This is possible.
Thank you. That makes me feel better too. I've been trying to prove all these things, but that makes me feel better. I don't want to keep you anymore. I know it's evening time and it's Monday soon for you. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I will go ahead and get these the questions out to you and email you in just a moment. But this has been amazing. I feel privileged to be sitting in front of you when I have your thesis next to me. It's just mind blowing. So, yay!
I'm very happy if I can help, and if